September 8, 1944, 6:43 p.m., London. Mrs. Ada Harrison is washing dishes in her Chiswick home when the world explodes. No warning, no air raid siren, no sound of approaching aircraft, just a massive detonation that obliterates her house and kills her instantly along with 2 neighbors. The blast crater is 30 feet wide. Buildings collapse for blocks around, and no one knows what happened. This isn't a bombing raid. The skies are clear, no planes visible. British air defenses detected nothing. Radar showed nothing. It's as if the explosion materialized from nowhere. And then, 42 seconds after the blast, people hear a strange sound, a supersonic boom rolling across London. The sound of something that had already arrived and destroyed, only now catching up to itself. The V-2 rocket had arrived, the world's first ballistic missile. Launched from the Netherlands, it had climbed 50 miles into space, arced over the North Sea, and plummeted onto London at 3,580 miles per hour. 5 times the speed of sound. No warning was possible. No defense existed. No interception could work. By the time you heard it, it had already hit. Hitler had promised this weapon would change everything, the Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon, that would answer British bombing of German cities, the technological marvel that would force Britain to surrender, the superweapon that would deliver victory when everything else had failed. And he was catastrophically wrong. Over the next 7 months, approximately 3,000 V-2s would be launched at Allied targets. They would kill about 2,700 British civilians and 2,500 Belgian civilians, devastating for those killed, terrifying for those targeted, but strategically, utterly meaningless. The V-2s didn't change British resolve, didn't force surrender, didn't alter the war's trajectory at all. But here's the truly insane part. The V-2 killed more people in its production than in its deployment. Approximately 12,000 slave laborers died building these rockets in underground factories, worked to death, starved, beaten, killed by cave-ins and explosions. The weapon cost more lives to make than it took from the enemy. And the cost wasn't just human. The V-2 program consumed resources that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Each rocket cost about $1.5 million in today's dollars. Over 3,000 rockets meant roughly $4.5 billion total, approximately the same as America's entire Manhattan Project. Germany spent as much on a weapon that killed 5,000 people as America spent on a weapon that killed $200,000 and ended the war. What could Germany have done with $4.5 billion instead? Built thousands of conventional aircraft, produced millions of artillery shells, manufactured hundreds of thousands of rifles and machine guns, supplied their armies with basic equipment that soldiers were desperately lacking by 1944. The V-2 was an engineering marvel that consumed resources that could have been used for basic military necessities. This is the pattern we're going to explore. Hitler's obsession with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, that would somehow reverse Germany's inevitable defeat through technological miracles. Jet aircraft, super-heavy tanks, missiles, weapons so advanced, so powerful, so revolutionary, that they would overcome Germany's strategic disadvantages in manpower, resources, and industrial capacity. Every single one failed, not because the engineering was bad. Some of these weapons were genuinely revolutionary, but because Hitler and his regime fundamentally misunderstood how wars are won. They believed in game changers, in superweapons that would deliver victory through technological superiority alone. They ignored logistics, production capacity, strategic reality, and basic military necessity. They chased impossible dreams while their armies lacked basic supplies. By 1944, Germany was losing on every front. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy and were pushing into France. German cities were being systematically destroyed by bombing. Resources were scarce. Manpower was depleted. Defeat was inevitable to anyone thinking rationally. Hitler's response wasn't to seek peace, to consolidate defenses, to make pragmatic strategic decisions. His response was to double down on fantasy, to pour Germany's remaining resources into wonder weapons that would magically reverse their fortunes. To believe, or at least to make his generals believe, that technology would save them when reality said nothing could. The V-2 was just the beginning. There were jet fighters that arrived too late and burned too much fuel, super-heavy tanks that couldn't cross bridges and broke down constantly, experimental submarines that never became operational, long-range bombers that never got built, and projects so insane, like orbital mirrors to burn enemy cities from space, that they reveal just how detached from reality Hitler's regime had become. This isn't just a story about failed weapons, it's a story about how dictatorships in collapse refuse to accept reality, how authoritarian leaders surrounded by yes men make catastrophically bad decisions because no one can tell them the truth, how resources get wasted on impressive-sounding projects that have no practical value while basic necessities are ignored. And it's a pattern that repeats throughout history. Every dictator facing defeat seems to believe that some technological marvel will save them. Saddam Hussein's supergun, North Korea's constant missile tests. The pattern is consistent. When losing, dictators bet on wonder weapons instead of accepting strategic reality. Let me show you the weapons Hitler bet on. The billions wasted, the opportunities squandered, and why none of it mattered because Germany had already lost, not through lack of technology but through strategic overreach, industrial incapacity, and the mathematical reality that they were fighting enemies with far greater resources. The wonder weapons didn't fail because they weren't impressive. They failed because impressive weapons don't win wars. Logistics wins wars, industrial capacity wins wars, strategic realism wins wars. And Germany had none of those by 1944, no matter how many rockets they launched or jets they flew. Let's start with the weapons that actually made it to production, that actually saw combat, that actually demonstrated genuine technological advancement, and still didn't matter. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the jet that came too late, July 1944. A German pilot climbs into the cockpit of something unprecedented. The Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, no propeller, 2 jet engines mounted under swept wings. Top speed, 540 Mennen, nearly 200 manner faster than any Allied fighter, armed with 4 30-minute cannons that could shred a bomber in seconds. This was revolutionary technology. Allied pilots who encountered Me 262s were shocked by their speed. Traditional propeller fighters couldn't catch them. The Me 262 could attack, destroy, and escape before defenders could react. If Germany had deployed these in significant numbers earlier in the war, they might have made bomber raids over Germany prohibitively expensive. But they didn't, for several catastrophic reasons that perfectly illustrate how Hitler's decision-making crippled Germany's war effort. First, Hitler saw the prototype in 1943 and demanded it be converted to a bomber. Engineers explained this was stupid. The aircraft was designed as a fighter, its speed and agility were its advantages. Loading it with bombs would negate everything that made it special. Hitler didn't care. He wanted a fast bomber that could strike Allied positions after D-Day. So months were wasted trying to make the Me 262 into something it wasn't designed to be. Second, by the time production finally ramped up in 1944, Germany lacked the resources to use these jets effectively. The jet engines required rare materials. They burned fuel at absurd rates, 30 minutes of flight time per mission. By 1944, Germany was running out of fuel. These revolutionary aircraft sat on runways because there wasn't enough fuel to fly them regularly. Third, the jets required extensive pilot training. Jet flight characteristics were completely different from propeller aircraft, but Germany no longer had time or resources for extensive training programs. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than new ones could be trained, so these advanced aircraft were often flown by pilots who didn't understand how to use them properly. Fourth, Allied bombing was destroying German infrastructure. The factories producing Me 262s were bombed repeatedly. The runways where they operated were bombed. The fuel refineries supplying them were primary targets. Even when jets were available, the supporting infrastructure was crumbling. Germany produced about 1,400 Dasempwasser 262s. Only about 800 were delivered to combat units. Of those, maybe 200 were operational at any given time due to maintenance issues and fuel shortages. And while they shot down some Allied aircraft, estimates range from 150 to 500 Allied planes destroyed. This had zero strategic impact. The Allies could replace losses. Germany couldn't. The Me 262 was genuinely revolutionary technology. It proved jets were the future of aviation. But it came too late, in too small numbers, with inadequate support, hampered by Hitler's interference. A wonder weapon that failed not because the engineering was bad, but because Germany lacked the strategic position to use it effectively. The V2. Technology impressive, strategy terrible. We've already discussed the V2's arrival in London. Now let's examine why it was such a catastrophic waste of resources. The V-2 was genuinely impressive engineering. The world's first long-range ballistic missile, it could hit targets 200 miles away with reasonable accuracy. It traveled faster than sound, making defense impossible. It pioneered technologies that would later enable space exploration. The Saturn V rockets that took humans to the moon were designed by the same engineer, Wernher von Braun, who designed the V-2. But as a weapon, it was strategically worthless. Here's why. Cost effectiveness. Each V-2 cost enormous amounts of money and resources to produce. The payload was only 1 ton of explosives. A single B-17 bomber could carry 3 tons of bombs, was reusable, could hit multiple targets per mission, and cost less to build. The V-2 was literally the most expensive and least effective way to deliver explosives that Germany could have chosen. Accuracy. The V-2 had an accuracy of about 5 miles. You could aim at central London, but couldn't guarantee hitting anything more specific than somewhere in London. This made it useless against military targets. It was purely a terror weapon aimed at civilians, and even for terror, it was less effective than conventional bombing because the psychological impact was limited by the relatively small number of rockets. Production priority. Building V-2s required rare materials, skilled labor, and industrial capacity that Germany needed for other purposes. Every engineer working on rockets wasn't working on improving tanks or aircraft. Every factory producing V-2 components wasn't producing ammunition or vehicles. The opportunity cost was staggering. Slave labor. The V-2 program relied on concentration camp prisoners working in underground factories. Conditions were so horrible that approximately 12,000 died during production. This wasn't just morally horrific, it was practically stupid. Starving, brutalized workers aren't maximally productive. The cruelty wasn't just evil, it was inefficient. Hitler loved the V-2 because it was impressive, because it demonstrated German technological superiority, because it allowed him to claim he was striking back at enemies bombing German cities. But none of that mattered strategically. The V-2 didn't bring Britain closer to surrender, didn't force the Allies to divert significant resources to defense, didn't change anything except consuming resources Germany couldn't spare. The Tiger II, over-engineered into uselessness. The Tiger II heavy tank was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly impenetrable frontal armor, the most powerful tank gun of the war, psychological impact so strong that Allied soldiers often exaggerated Tiger II encounters in reports. When working properly, it was nearly unbeatable in direct combat. But when working properly was the problem. The Tiger II was so heavy, so complex, so over-engineered that it was more liability than asset. Weight. At 70 tons, the Tiger II was too heavy for most bridges. German engineers had to scout routes in advance to ensure bridges could support it. Often, it couldn't cross, requiring long detours or waiting for engineers to build reinforced crossings. Reliability. The Tiger II's transmission and engine were notoriously unreliable. Many Tiger IIs were abandoned not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they broke down and couldn't be repaired or recovered. Maintenance was complex and time-consuming. Parts were specialized and often unavailable. Fuel consumption. The Tiger II consumed fuel at absurd rates. In a war where Germany was increasingly short on fuel, fielding tanks that burned through supplies faster than they could be delivered was suicidal logistics. Many Tiger IIs were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Production. Germany produced only 489 Tiger IIs total. Compare that to 49,000 Soviet T-34s. The Tiger II was individually superior, but when the enemy could swarm you with 10 tanks for every one you fielded, individual superiority didn't matter. Germany needed quantity. Instead, they chased quality to an extreme that made their tanks expensive, rare, and logistically impossible. Allied response. The Allies adapted to German heavy tanks by using air power, artillery, and combined arms tactics. They didn't try to match German tank quality, they just destroyed them from the air or outmaneuvered them. No amount of armor matters when you're being bombed from above or surrounded by faster tanks. The Tiger II perfectly encapsulates Germany's Wunderwaffen problem, impressive engineering that ignored practical military requirements. Yes, it could win individual engagements. No, that didn't matter when Germany couldn't produce or support them in numbers that would affect strategic outcomes. These three weapons, the Me-262, the V2, and the Tiger II, represent the pattern. Germany developing genuinely advanced technology that arrived too late in too small numbers without adequate support, consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere. Hitler's wonder weapons weren't failures of engineering, they were failures of strategy, logistics, and reality-based planning, and these were the weapons that actually made it to production. Wait until you see the weapons that were too insane to even build. Hitler's actual produced wonder weapons were bad enough. But the projects that never made it past planning stages reveal just how detached from reality his regime had become. These weren't just overambitious. They were delusional fantasies that engineers were forced to pretend to take seriously. The Panzer VIII Maus, the tank too heavy to fight. Someone in Germany's tank design bureau decided that 70-ton tanks weren't heavy enough. They proposed the Maus, Maus in German, which is either the darkest irony in military history or evidence that German humor had completely broken. A super-heavy tank weighing 188 tons. Let's put that in perspective. 188 tons is heavier than a modern commercial airliner. It's the weight of 3 M1 Abrams tanks. It's so heavy that no existing bridge in Europe could support it. No existing tank transporter could move it. No existing roads could handle it without breaking down. The solution? The Maus would drive underwater. Seriously. Engineers designed it to ford rivers by driving along the bottom, sealed against water, supplied with air through a snorkel. A 188-ton tank that couldn't cross bridges would instead cross rivers by driving underwater like some sort of armored submarine. The problems with this concept are almost too many to list. The Maus was so heavy it could barely move. Top speed was 8 mph on roads, slower off-road. It required an enormous engine that consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. It was so large that it made an enormous target. Its weight meant it would sink into soft ground, get stuck in mud, crush roads, and be essentially immobile in any terrain that wasn't concrete. And what did you get for all these disadvantages? Thick armor and a big gun. The same things you got from a Tiger II that weighed 118 tons less. The Maus offered no practical advantages over existing heavy tanks, except being even heavier, slower, and more logistically impossible. Germany actually built 2 prototypes. One was tested, it moved, technically. It didn't sink through the earth or spontaneously explode. This apparently counted as success. Both prototypes were destroyed by German forces before advancing Soviet armies could capture them. The Soviets recovered the remains and reassembled one Maus from parts, which is now in a museum in Russia, serving as a monument to engineering that prioritized impressive specifications over practical utility. The Maus was everything wrong with Hitler's wonder weapon obsession in one vehicle. Bigger, heavier, more powerful, completely impractical. Developed because Hitler wanted super weapons that sounded impressive in briefings, not weapons that soldiers could actually use in combat. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte. When too insane becomes understatement. The Maus wasn't crazy enough. Someone looked at the 188-ton Maus and thought, you know what this needs? To be 5 times heavier. The Landkreuzer P-1000 Ratte, Landcruiser P-1000 Rat, was a proposed tank weighing 1,000 metric tons. 1,000 tons. This wasn't a tank. This was a ship that someone decided should drive on land. It would have been 115 feet long, 46 feet wide, and 36 feet tall. Armed with naval artillery, specifically the guns from the Bismarck battleship, crewed by over 40 people, requiring multiple engines producing 17,000 total horsepower just to move its absurd bulk. The Ratte was never built because even Hitler's engineers eventually convinced him it was insane. But the fact that serious design work was done, that engineers spent time calculating specifications, that resources were devoted to studying this project, that reveals how divorced from military reality Germany had become by 1942 when this was proposed. A 1,000-ton vehicle couldn't cross any bridge, couldn't traverse most roads without destroying them, would sink into any soft ground, would be visible from miles away, would be the single largest target any Air Force had ever seen, would consume fuel at rates that would require a dedicated supply convoy just to keep it operational, would be so slow that defending armies could simply withdraw and attack it with aircraft or artillery from beyond its range. The Ratte wasn't a weapon. It was a monument to engineering hubris, a physical manifestation of the belief that size and power matter more than mobility, sustainability, and practical utility. It's telling that this project was proposed the same year that Germany's advances into the Soviet Union were grinding to a halt because they couldn't maintain supply lines for ordinary tanks. The sun gun. Yes, seriously. Some German scientists proposed building a giant mirror in space that would concentrate sunlight into a beam capable of burning enemy cities. This project was actually studied during the war. Resources were spent on this. Engineers did calculations. The concept dated back to the 1920s, proposed by physicist Hermann Oberth. The idea was to place a 5,000-foot wide mirror in orbit 22,000 miles above Earth, where it would reflect and focus sunlight onto targets below, creating a heat beam that could ignite cities or boil oceans. In 1945, Allied forces discovered documents showing that Nazi scientists had been studying this concept seriously. They'd calculated that such a mirror could be built in 10 to 15 years. They'd discussed launching it using rockets, which Germany didn't have, and assembling it in orbit, which was impossible with any technology that existed or would exist for decades. This project demonstrates complete detachment from reality. Germany in 1945 was being invaded from east and west, running out of resources, losing tens of thousands of soldiers per week, and engineers were spending time calculating how to build orbital death rays that wouldn't be possible for decades using technology that didn't exist. The America bomber, bombing New York from Berlin. Hitler wanted to strike America directly. He was obsessed with the propaganda value of bombing New York City, so he commissioned designs for a long-range bomber that could fly from Germany to New York, drop bombs, and return. The problem, this required a bomber with a range of over 7,000 miles. Nothing like this existed. To carry significant bombs that distance required an aircraft so large, with so much fuel capacity, that it would need to be the size of a modern commercial airliner. Various designs were proposed. All were impractical. Some required mid-air refueling. Germany had no aerial refueling capability. Some were too large to be built with available resources. Some had specifications that were theoretically possible, but practically impossible given Germany's industrial capacity and resource limitations. The America Bomber project consumed design resources through 1944. Engineers working on this fantasy bomber weren't working on improving existing aircraft that might have actually helped Germany's air defense. They were pursuing Hitler's propaganda obsession with punching America in the nose, even though bombing New York would have zero strategic value and would be logistically impossible anyway. These projects, Maus, Ratte, Sungun, America Bomber, reveal the same pathology. Hitler and his regime prioritized impressive-sounding weapons that would make good propaganda over practical weapons that soldiers actually needed. They allocated resources to fantasy projects while ignoring basic military requirements. They created a culture where engineers were rewarded for proposing ambitious projects rather than questioning whether those projects made strategic sense. This wasn't just about Hitler's personal delusions. This was systemic dysfunction in how Nazi Germany approached military technology. No one could tell the Führer that his ideas were stupid. Every ambitious proposal was encouraged because ambition itself was valued over practicality. Designers competed to propose the most impressive-sounding projects, knowing that practical objections would be ignored or punished. The wonder weapons that never got built are just as important as the ones that did, because they reveal the thinking that produced the ones that did. A regime that seriously studied orbital mirrors and 1,000-ton tanks was the same regime that poured billions into V-2 rockets and super-heavy tanks that consumed resources Germany couldn't spare for negligible strategic gain. And while German engineers were drawing up plans for space mirrors and 1,000-ton tanks, Soviet engineers were refining the T-34 into a reliable, mass-producible tank that would roll over Germany in vast numbers. American engineers were developing the unglamorous but effective M4 Sherman that could be produced in tens of thousands. British engineers were working on radar, sonar, and code breaking that actually affected strategic outcomes. Germany was losing because they were fighting enemies with greater resources, industrial capacity, and manpower. No wonder weapon could overcome those disadvantages. But Hitler couldn't accept that reality, so he bet on miracles and lost everything. Let's talk about what Germany sacrificed to chase Hitler's technological fantasies. because every ton of steel used for experimental tanks was steel that wasn't used for ammunition. Every engineer designing rocket missiles wasn't designing improvements to existing weapons. Every Reichsmark spent on wonder weapons was a Reichsmark not spent on basic military supplies that frontline soldiers desperately needed. By 1944, the German military was experiencing critical shortages across the board. Ammunition was rationed, fuel was scarce, spare parts for vehicles were often unavailable, soldiers were wearing inadequate clothing in winter, food supplies were insufficient, basic medical supplies were running low. The Wehrmacht, once the most powerful military force in Europe, was increasingly relying on horses for transportation because they lacked trucks and fuel. And while German soldiers froze and starved and fought with inadequate supplies, Hitler's regime was pouring resources into projects like the V2 program, 4.5 billion in today's money, spent to kill 5,000 people. The V2 program consumed more resources than any other German weapons project. Approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks were spent developing and producing these rockets. For context, that's roughly equivalent to the entire cost of America's Manhattan Project. What could Germany have done with 2 billion Reichsmarks instead? Analysis suggests they could have produced 24,000 fighter aircraft. Germany produced about 40,000 total throughout the entire war, built 33,000 tanks, manufactured enough ammunition to supply their entire military for months, significantly expanded synthetic fuel production, addressing one of their most critical shortages. Every V2 that launched represented resources that could have equipped dozens of soldiers with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Every underground factory building rockets was a facility that wasn't producing aircraft or artillery. Every enslaved worker dying in missile production was labor that could have been used productively, though we should note that using enslaved labor at all was both morally abhorrent and economically inefficient. Brutalized workers aren't productive workers. The Me-262 program, revolutionary technology, catastrophic priorities. The Me-262 jet fighter program also consumed enormous resources. Development costs alone exceeded 100 million Reichsmarks. Production required rare metals like cobalt and molybdenum that Germany had difficulty sourcing. The jet engines required specialized alloys and precision manufacturing that diverted industrial capacity from other projects. But the real cost was opportunity. German aircraft manufacturers were producing fighter aircraft that burned fuel they didn't have, required pilot training programs they couldn't sustain, and consumed resources they desperately needed elsewhere. Germany's problem in 1944 wasn't that their aircraft were too slow, it was that they didn't have enough aircraft, period. Focusing on revolutionary technology instead of ramping up production of existing designs was strategically catastrophic. And then there was Hitler's interference. When Hitler demanded the Me-262 be converted to a bomber, engineers wasted months modifying the design. When he finally allowed it to be used as a fighter, production was already years behind where it needed to be. Hitler's personal obsession with striking back at enemies, even though bombing with jets was less effective than defending with jets, directly reduced the weapon's potential effectiveness. The super-heavy tank programs, steel that should have been armor for ordinary tanks, the Tiger II, Maus, and other super-heavy tank programs consumed thousands of tons of steel, particularly the specialized armor plate that Germany was desperately short of by 1944. That steel could have been used to produce many more medium tanks, which Germany needed far more urgently than a small number of super-heavy vehicles. Germany produced about 1,350 Tiger I tanks, 489 Tiger IIs, and various other heavy tank models. Together, these consumed enormous amounts of steel and manufacturing capacity. For comparison, the Soviet Union produced nearly 60,000 T-34 medium tanks. Germany's approach to tank design, prioritizing individual superiority over mass production, was exactly backwards for a country facing enemies with overwhelming industrial capacity. But this approach made sense within Nazi ideology. The regime valued German racial superiority and believed that superior German engineering and better quality weapons would overcome numerical disadvantages. They couldn't accept that wars are won by logistics, production capacity, and resource management, not by having individually superior weapons. The human cost, slave labor that died for nothing. Beyond the material waste was the human cost. Many wonder weapon projects relied on concentration camp labor. The V2 program alone killed approximately 12,000 prisoners, more than the rockets killed in combat. These prisoners were worked to death in underground factories, starved, beaten, killed by cave-ins and explosions, denied medical care. This wasn't just morally horrific, it was practically stupid. Enslaved workers who are starving and brutalized aren't maximally productive. Germany's labor shortage was one of their critical problems, using available labor to literally work people to death while producing weapons of negligible strategic value was a catastrophic misallocation of human resources. Some historians argue that Germany could have fought longer or more effectively if they'd focused on practical weapons production instead of wonder weapons. That's probably true, though it wouldn't have changed the war's outcome. Germany was facing enemies with far greater industrial capacity and resources. No amount of better allocation would have overcome their fundamental disadvantages. But imagine if Germany had taken all the resources invested in wonder weapons, and instead dramatically expanded synthetic fuel production to address their most critical shortage, mass-produced simple, reliable versions of existing weapons, improved logistics and supply chains, better equipped soldiers with basic necessities. The war might have lasted longer, casualties might have been higher, but Germany still would have lost because they were fighting enemies with greater resources, manpower, and industrial capacity. Wonder weapons couldn't overcome those fundamental disadvantages. Practical weapons couldn't either. Germany had already lost by 1943, they just hadn't accepted it yet. And that's the real story here. The wonder weapons weren't about winning, they were about refusing to accept defeat. Hitler couldn't admit that Germany had overreached, that their enemies were stronger, that surrender or negotiation was the only rational path forward. So he bet on miracles, on technological breakthroughs that would somehow reverse irreversible strategic realities. His generals knew this was insane. Many tried to tell him, but telling Hitler he was wrong was dangerous. The regime had created a culture where questioning the Führer's judgment could get you killed. So engineers pretended orbital mirrors were feasible. Generals pretended wonder weapons would save Germany. Everyone participated in the collective delusion because the alternative was admitting defeat or being purged for defeatism. The wonder weapons were symptoms of a dying regime that couldn't accept reality. They wasted billions and killed thousands in their production while providing negligible strategic benefit. And they've become historical lessons about the dangers of chasing technological miracles while ignoring practical necessities. Every dictator facing defeat should study this history. Every military planner should understand these failures. Every engineer should recognize when impressive specifications don't translate to practical utility. The wonder weapons failed spectacularly, and their failure teaches us far more than their impressive engineering achievements. Hitler is dead. His wonder weapons are museum pieces and historical footnotes. The V2 technology eventually enabled space exploration, but that doesn't redeem its wartime waste. The Me-262 proved jets were the future, but arrived too late to matter. The super-heavy tanks demonstrated the limits of over-engineering, but the pattern Hitler established, dictators in trouble betting on wonder weapons, that pattern hasn't died. It repeats, again and again. Because the psychology that drives it is consistent across authoritarian regimes and historical periods. The pattern. When losing, double down on technology. Let's examine how this pattern has repeated since Hitler, Iraq's Project Babylon, 1980s, 1990s, the supergun that couldn't Saddam Hussein, facing military stalemate with Iran and international isolation, commissioned engineer Gerald Bull to design a supergun capable of launching satellites or weapons from Iraqi territory into orbit or at distant targets. The gun would have been enormous, barrel over 500 feet long, capable of firing projectiles weighing 2 tons. Sound familiar? Like Hitler's America bomber or orbital mirror, Saddam wanted a dramatic technological achievement that would demonstrate Iraqi capability and potentially threaten enemies at long range. Bull was assassinated, probably by Israeli intelligence, in 1990. The project died. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait led to their military destruction by coalition forces using conventional weapons. The supergun, like Hitler's wonder weapons, would have consumed resources Iraq needed for practical military capabilities while delivering minimal strategic value. North Korea's missile program, 1990s present. Propaganda weapons. North Korea is perhaps the perfect modern example of Hitler's wonder weapon logic. They're a poor country with limited resources facing vastly stronger enemies, South Korea with US backing. Their military is outdated, their economy is failing, their people are starving. Their rational move would be accepting their strategic position and seeking accommodation with neighbors. Instead, they've poured enormous resources into nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Like Hitler's V-2s, these are technically impressive. North Korea has demonstrated nuclear capability in missiles that can potentially reach the United States. Like Hitler's V-2s, they're strategically questionable. North Korea can't win a war against South Korea and the US regardless of whether they have nuclear weapons, because any use of nuclear weapons would result in their complete destruction. So why do it? Same reason Hitler built V-2s: propaganda, demonstrating technological capability. Regime prestige, making the leadership feel powerful when everything else suggests weakness. The missiles are expensive, consume resources North Korea desperately needs for feeding its population, and don't actually improve North Korea's strategic position. But they're impressive. They make news. They make the regime seem more powerful than it is. The persistent pattern: technology as substitute for strategy. Why do dictators keep making this mistake? Several psychological and structural factors. First, dictators can't accept defeat. Democratic leaders facing military failure can negotiate, compromise, resign, or be voted out. Their personal identity isn't tied to never admitting weakness. Dictators facing defeat face personal destruction. They'll be killed, tried for war crimes, or at best exiled in disgrace. So they can't accept that they're losing. They must believe victory is possible. Wunderwaffens provide that belief. Second, authoritarian systems punish bearers of bad news. When telling the leader that his strategy is failing might get you executed, people stop telling the leader the truth. They tell him what he wants to hear. This creates information bubbles where dictators are surrounded by yes-men confirming that wunderwaffens will work, that victory is possible, that the situation isn't as dire as reality suggests. Third, technological solutions feel like rational planning. Admitting you're losing requires accepting that your strategy, ideology, and leadership have failed. That's psychologically devastating and politically dangerous. Betting on wunderwaffens feels like rational problem-solving. We're losing because our technology isn't advanced enough, so we'll develop better technology. It's an explanation that doesn't require admitting fundamental strategic failure. Fourth, wunderwaffens provide propaganda value even when they fail strategically. Hitler could claim Germany was striking back at Britain with V-2s, even though the rockets accomplished nothing strategically. North Korea can claim they're a nuclear power, even though using nuclear weapons would ensure their destruction. The weapons provide domestic propaganda and international prestige, even when they don't improve actual military position. Fifth, dictatorships misunderstand how wars are won. Democratic militaries tend to understand that wars are won through logistics, industrial capacity, alliance building, and sustainable strategy. They've usually fought multiple wars with different enemies and learned from varied experiences. Dictators often believe wars are won through will, superior culture or race, technological breakthroughs, and dramatic actions. They've usually risen to power through force and have limited understanding of complex military logistics. The counterexample: why democracies? Usually. Avoid this trap. Democratic militaries aren't immune to technological overinvestment. The US has canceled many expensive weapons programs that didn't work. But democracies have structural advantages that reduce wunderwaffen pathology. Civilian oversight: military leaders must justify spending to civilian politicians and ultimately to voters. This creates pressure to demonstrate practical value, not just impressive specifications. Competitive analysis: democratic systems allow critics to challenge weapons programs publicly. Media investigates. Opposition politicians question spending. This creates feedback loops that can cancel failing projects. Professional military culture: democratic militaries develop institutional knowledge and professional norms that prioritize practical effectiveness. But the pattern Hitler established, dictators in trouble betting on wunderwaffens, that pattern hasn't died. It repeats again and again, because the psychology that drives it is consistent across authoritarian regimes and historical periods. The pattern: when losing, double down on technology. Let's examine how this pattern has repeated since Hitler, Iraq's Project Babylon, 1980s, 1990s, The supergun that couldn't Saddam Hussein, facing military stalemate with Iran and international isolation, commissioned engineer Gerald Bull to design a supergun capable of launching satellites or weapons from Iraqi territory into orbit or at distant targets. The gun would have been enormous, barrel over 500 feet long, capable of firing projectiles weighing 2 tons. Sound familiar? Like Hitler's America bomber or orbital mirror, Saddam wanted a dramatic technological achievement that would demonstrate Iraqi capability and potentially threaten enemies at long range. Bull was assassinated, probably by Israeli intelligence, in 1990. The project died. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait led to their military destruction by coalition forces using conventional weapons. The supergun, like Hitler's Wunderwaffen, would have consumed resources Iraq needed for practical military capabilities while delivering minimal strategic value. North Korea's missile program, 1990s present, propaganda weapons. North Korea is perhaps the perfect modern example of Hitler's Wunderwaffen logic. They're a poor country with limited resources facing vastly stronger enemies, South Korea with US backing. Their military is outdated, their economy is failing, their people are starving. Their rational move would be accepting their strategic position and seeking accommodation with neighbors. Instead, they've poured enormous resources into nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Like Hitler's V2s, these are technically impressive. North Korea has demonstrated nuclear capability and missiles that can potentially reach the United States. Like Hitler's V2s, they're strategically questionable. North Korea can't win a war against South Korea and the US regardless of whether they have nuclear weapons, because any use of nuclear weapons would result in their complete destruction. So why do it? Same reason Hitler built V2s: propaganda. Demonstrating technological capability, regime prestige, making the leadership feel powerful when everything else suggests weakness. The missiles are expensive, consume resources North Korea desperately needs for feeding its population, and don't actually improve North Korea's strategic position. But they're impressive. They make news. They make the regime seem more powerful than it is. The persistent pattern. Technology as substitute for strategy. Why do dictators keep making this mistake? Several psychological and structural factors. First, dictators can't accept defeat. Democratic leaders facing military failure can negotiate, compromise, resign, or be voted out. Their personal identity isn't tied to never admitting weakness. Dictators facing defeat face personal destruction. They'll be killed, tried for war crimes, or at best exiled in disgrace. So they can't accept that they're losing. They must believe victory is possible. Wunderwaffen provide that belief. Second, authoritarian systems punish bearers of bad news. When telling the leader that his strategy is failing might get you executed, people stop telling the leader the truth. They tell him what he wants to hear. This creates information bubbles where dictators are surrounded by yes-men confirming that Wunderwaffen will work, that victory is possible, that the situation isn't as dire as reality suggests. Third, technological solutions feel like rational planning. Admitting you're losing requires accepting that your strategy, ideology, and leadership have failed. That's psychologically devastating and politically dangerous. Betting on Wunderwaffen feels like rational problem-solving. We're losing because our technology isn't advanced enough, so we'll develop better technology. It's an explanation that doesn't require admitting fundamental strategic failure. Fourth, Wunderwaffen provide propaganda value even when they fail strategically. Hitler could claim Germany was striking back at Britain with V2s, even though the rockets accomplished nothing strategically. North Korea can claim they're a nuclear power, even though using nuclear weapons would ensure their destruction. The weapons provide domestic propaganda and international prestige, even when they don't improve actual military position. Fifth, dictatorships misunderstand how wars are won. Democratic militaries tend to understand that wars are won through logistics, industrial capacity, alliance building, and sustainable strategy. They've usually fought multiple wars with different enemies and learned from varied experiences. Dictators often believe wars are won through will, superior culture or race, technological breakthroughs, and dramatic actions. They've usually risen to power through force and have limited understanding of complex military logistics. The counterexample: why democracies, usually? Avoid this trap. Democratic militaries aren't immune to technological overinvestment. The US has canceled many expensive weapons programs that didn't work. But democracies have structural advantages that reduce wonder weapon pathology. Civilian oversight, military leaders must justify spending to civilian politicians and ultimately to voters. This creates pressure to demonstrate practical value, not just impressive specifications. Competitive analysis. Democratic systems allow critics to challenge weapons programs publicly. Media investigates. Opposition politicians question spending. This creates feedback loops that can cancel failing projects. Professional military culture. Democratic militaries develop institutional knowledge and professional norms that prioritize practical effectiveness. They are incentivized to tell the truth about what works and what doesn't because their careers depend on real-world mission success, not on flattering the leader's technological fantasies. This culture of candor and realism acts as a powerful check on the wonder weapon impulse. They understand that 1,000 well-supplied tanks are better than one experimental super tank that breaks down after 5 miles. The final psychological trap. The dictator's mirror. The wonder weapon impulse is ultimately a psychological defense mechanism writ large. It is the dictator's refusal to accept reality. It is the final, desperate gamble of a man who has surrounded himself with mirrors, who has silenced every voice of dissent, and who believes his own will can bend the laws of physics and logistics. The dictator, facing the inevitable collapse of his regime, is not looking for a practical military solution. He is looking for a miracle. He is looking for a technological deus ex machina to validate his ideology and his personal genius. And this is the most dangerous part of the pattern. When the wonder weapon fails, the dictator doesn't learn. He doubles down. He orders more resources, more speed, more cruelty in the pursuit of the next impossible dream, because admitting the dream is impossible means admitting that he is the failure. And for a dictator, that is the one truth that cannot be spoken. The V2s did not save Hitler. Project Babylon did not save Saddam. And the next dictator, facing the same impossible choice between strategic reality and technological fantasy, will choose the fantasy. The pattern repeats because the human mind, when given absolute power, will always prefer a spectacular lie to a devastating truth. The question is not if the next wonder weapon will be built. The question is who will be the next dictator to sacrifice his nation's last resources on the altar of a technological illusion. And who will be the next generation of scientists to be seduced into building it.